The strongest man in the empire was also the most obedient coward who ever wore a crown. Not obedient to law, not obedient to duty, obedient to desire, and that is the most dangerous master any alpha can serve. Today we watch a king trade his greatest treasure for the one thing he already had, power, and lose everything. Stay until the end. You will not regret it. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The feast hall of Thornspire Palace had been built to make men feel small. That was the point. Every column of black granite rose 40 feet before it met the vaulted ceiling, and the torches mounted along those columns burned with a low orange light that turned faces into masks, gold on the forehead, shadow under the eyes. The architects who designed this hall 300 years ago understood something that most rulers never learned. A man who felt physically diminished the moment he walked through a door was already half defeated before he opened his mouth. King Darius Thorncrest understood this. He had used this hall his entire reign to break negotiators, humble rival lords, and remind every alpha within his borders who the apex of this continent truly was. He understood it, and tonight he had forgotten it completely. He sat at the head of the long obsidian table, 20 noble lords arranged on either side in descending rank, a spread of roasted boar and dark wine before them that could have fed a village for a week. The celebration was official. The Luna Elara Ashwin Thorncrest had entered her final weeks of pregnancy, carrying the twin heirs the kingdom had waited 9 years for. Every noble house had sent representatives. The wine was deep and expensive. The music from the gallery above was clean and measured. Darius was not listening to any of it. His eyes, amber dark and flat with something that was not quite guilt and not quite hunger but lived in the hollow between them, tracked to the far end of the hall where Lady Celine Morvain stood near the window arch. She was not seated at the table. She had not been invited to sit at the table. She held a goblet in one hand and spoke to Lord Fenwick Callis, one of the treasury ministers, and she laughed at something he said. A controlled, precise sound, like a blade being tested for flex. She did not look at Darius. That was why he could not stop looking at her. "My king," the voice came from his left. Darius pulled his gaze back to the table. Lord Commander Bastian Grieve, 60 years old and built like a man who had spent those years being hit, was watching him with an expression that was carefully neutral. "The council wishes to know your thoughts on the Eastern grain levy before the harvest month." "Table it," Darius said. "We tabled it last month." "Then table it again." Bastian's jaw worked once. He had served 3 Thorncrest kings. He had learned when to push and when to let a thing go. He let it go. The feast continued. A singer came down from the gallery and performed a composition about the glory of the Thorncrest line, about twin sons born under favorable stars who would extend the empire's reach to the sea. The nobles applauded at the appropriate moments. Darius lifted his wine and did not drink it. He was watching Celine again. She had moved. She stood now closer to the side corridor that led toward the east wing, and her eyes, gray as January ice, never warm, always calculating, finally found his across the length of the hall. She held the look for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked through the corridor door. Darius set down his wine. "I require a moment," he said to no one in particular, and rose from the head of the table. Lord Bastian did not watch him go. That too was something he had learned. The east corridor was empty and cold. The torches here burned lower, palace staff having not yet made their evening rounds. Darius moved through the shadow with the particular ease of a man accustomed to his own domain, and he turned the second corner to find Celine waiting in the alcove beside the archive door. She did not step toward him. She never stepped toward him. That was one of the things that had undone him, the absolute stillness she maintained, as if she had all the time in the world and was simply choosing, generously, to spend some of it on him. "You looked bored," she said. "It's a feast in honor of my wife's pregnancy." "Yes." She tilted her head. "You looked bored." He crossed the space between them, and her free hand came up to his chest. Not pushing him away, not pulling him closer, just resting there like she was taking his temperature. Her fingers were cool. They always were. "This is the last time," he said. She smiled. It did not reach her eyes because her eyes did not participate in her smiles. You said that the last time. I mean it. Darius. She said his name the way other people said yours. Flat, certain, as if she had titled the conversation already, and was simply waiting for him to catch up. You are the strongest alpha on this continent. You command 40,000 wolves. You have broken 3 rival kingdoms in open war, and you cannot walk past the corridor without coming to find me. She let her hand drop. That is not a weakness I am exploiting. That is a truth you are hiding from. What truth? That you built the cage yourself. He stared at her. The torchlight from the alcove entrance caught the planes of her face. High cheekbones, the sharp line of her jaw, the kind of beauty that looked engineered rather than grown. She was 31 years old and had been in the royal court since she was 19, the daughter of a minor noble house that had spent 3 generations trying to marry upward. She had never made the mistake of being obvious about it. Elara carries your sons, he said. The name felt strange in this corridor, in this moment, like speaking of water while standing in fire. I know, Celine said simply. She is very devoted to that task. Something tightened in his chest that he chose not to examine. You will return to the feast. We won't meet again until after the birth, after the ceremony. Of course. She inclined her head with the grace of a woman who had won the argument and was kind enough not to say so. Go back to your table, my king. Your lords are watching your chair. He left. She stayed in the alcove for another minute, her goblet held loosely, her eyes on the middle distance. Then she too returned to the feast. Through the opposite corridor, entering from the south arch, arriving back near Lord Kalos, as if she had simply stepped out for air. No one had seen them together. No one who mattered. Hot. Elara Ashwin Thorncrest was in the east solar when the feast ended, seated near the broad window that looked out over the palace gardens, her hands folded over the architecture of her belly. She was 34 years old and had spent 9 of those years learning to read runes the way other women read books. Through the gaps, through what was missing, through the silence between sentences. She was not beautiful the way Celine Morvain was beautiful. That was a thing she had understood about herself early and accepted without rancor. She had a face that rewarded patience, strong jaw, wide-set eyes the color of dark amber, a mouth that had learned to stay still when the rest of her wanted to move. She had been the daughter of the Ashwin bloodline, one of the oldest in the Northern Territories, a family whose alpha lineage predated the Thorncrests by 200 years. Her father had arranged the match when she was 25. She had married Darius at 26, with her eyes open. She had loved him anyway. That was the part she had never found a way to negotiate with. Her handmaiden Mira entered through the side door carrying a tray of warm broth and bread. Mira was 17 and had the gift of knowing when not to speak. She set the tray on the low table beside the chair and began to withdraw. He left the feast early, Elara said. Mira stopped. My Luna. Not a question. I heard the hall from here. A pause. Did you see which corridor he took? A long silence. Mira was 17, but she was not stupid. The East Hall, my Luna. Elara looked at the window. The garden below was dark, the hedgerows trimmed into the angular shapes that Darius preferred. Clean, controlled, no soft edges. She had always thought they looked like a kingdom, seen from above, every shrub aware of its exact border. Thank you, she said. Leave the tray. Mira left. Elara sat for a long time with her hands on her belly. The boys moved sometimes in the night, these small interior earthquakes that she had long since stopped being startled by and had come instead to rely on. They moved now, a slow shift of weight, a pressure below her ribs that made her exhale. She thought about what she knew. She knew the East Corridor. She knew that Celine Morvain had been positioned near the corridor entrance at the beginning of the feast and had not been positioned there later. She knew that her husband had excused himself at roughly the same time for what he had described to the table, according to Lord Bastian, who had briefly passed her chamber's door that afternoon, as a moment. She knew the specific quality of guilt that lived in Darius's posture when he returned to a room. She had first noticed it 4 months ago. She had told herself she was wrong. She had gone on telling herself that. She stopped telling herself that now. She did not cry. That surprised her, in a distant way. She had always assumed that the moment of real understanding, when it came, would be a different kind of experience. More noise, more collapse. But there was nothing dramatic in it. It was simply a door closing, and the sound of the latch dropping into place, and the particular silence that followed. She ate the bread. She drank the broth. She went to bed and slept because the twins needed her to sleep, and there was no version of the next weeks that would be easier for going to pieces tonight. Ronan came first, in the gray hour before dawn. The midwives had been with Elara since midnight, the chamber lit with the low warmth of a dozen candles, and when the first cry cut through the palace, the sound traveled through stone walls and torchlit corridors, and into the council anteroom where Darius stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing. He did not move. He simply stood there while the sound reached him and registered, and something in his face shifted, cracked slightly, the way ice sounds when the temperature changes and the surface adjusts. His heir. He crossed his hands over his chest and pressed once, hard, as if confirming that his heart was still in the correct location. Then the second cry came. 15 minutes later, lower in pitch, more insistent, a sound that already had an opinion about the world it had entered, and the door opened and the senior midwife appeared with blood on her apron and exhaustion in her eyes, and told him it was done. He walked down the corridor to the birth chamber. Elara was sitting upright in the bed when he entered. She had been cleaned and her hair had been braided back from her face, and she was holding a child against each arm with the careful exactness of a woman who had decided that whatever else was true, these two things were her responsibility, and she was not going to do that badly. She looked up at him when he came through the door. She had known, before the twins, that she could love something more than her own life. She had understood it abstractly, the way you understand that a mountain is tall before you have stood at its base. Holding Ronan in the first hour, she understood it bodily, the way the cold understands it is cold, completely, without argument. She had also spent those hours thinking, very quietly, about the East Corridor. "They're strong," she told Darius. Her voice was level. She was very tired, and her body felt like it had been wrung out from the inside, but her voice was level. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his sons. His face was doing something complicated that she did not have the energy to translate. His eyes moved from one child to the other and then to her, and there was something in them she had not seen in some time, something real, unperformed, the specific shock of a man encountering consequence. "Elara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. She looked back down at her sons. Ronan had dark hair, almost black, curled tight against his skull. Kael was lighter, gray-eyed already, watching the candle flames with the focused attention of someone trying to understand the rules of fire. Two different personalities already in 2 hours of life. That struck her as right. She had never wanted carbon copies. She had wanted people. "You should go tell the court," she said. "They'll be waiting." He went. Yeah. Lord Minister Cregan Voss found Celine Morvain in her chambers on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, and she did not pretend to be asleep. Voss was 58 years old, slope-shouldered, with the look of a man who had discovered 20 years ago that ambition was more comfortable worn on the inside. He had served in the treasury since Darius's father's time. He had money. He had information. What he had never had was protection from the next regime. He had started meeting with Celine 6 months ago. "The twins are born," he said from just inside the door. Celine was seated at her writing table. She had not undressed for the night. Her gray eyes tracked to him without particular urgency. "Healthy?" "Both. Boys. Ronan and Kael." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the quill she'd set aside and tapped it once against the edge of the table. "2 healthy princes," she said, "both carrying Thorncrest blood." Another pause. "That is a problem. For our purposes." "For our purposes, yes." She set the quill down. "Where does the court stand?" "Celebrating. They'll celebrate for 3 days at minimum. The noble houses are already talking succession, co-rule potential, which heir leads which territory. The lords who were unhappy with the king's decisions last year have found a reason to be content again." Voss paused. "The Luna's stock has risen." Celine's expression did not change. "Of course it has. She produced heirs. She folded her hands on the table. And Darius? Watching the children. A sound that meant nothing and contained everything. We need to move before they're named in the royal record, before the houses formally align their loyalties to her line. That timeline is what it is. Do you have the materials I requested? Voss reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He crossed the room and placed it on the table before her. She did not open it immediately. She looked at it with the particular consideration of someone who has been imagining a tool and is now seeing it for the first time in the physical world. Correspondence, Voss said, from the archive's backup files. The Luna's seal is on the outer sheet. That was genuine, lifted from an approved water contract from 2 years ago. The content inside is ours. Who handled the forgery? Kalos's man. No direct connection. Letters alone aren't enough. The court has seen forgeries. Half of them have commissioned forgeries. She opened the document now and read it with her eyes moving in small, controlled movements down the page. This names the Valdris Pact specifically? Alpha Korn Valdris, the northern rival house. Good. He's been making noise about border territory. It's plausible. She refolded the document with care. I need a witness. Someone credible who can testify they saw correspondence leave the palace through the Luna's personal staff. I have a name. Buy them. Don't threaten. Threats create resentment, and resentment talks. Bought men are invested in the outcome. Voss nodded slowly. He was watching her with an expression that sat somewhere between admiration and the particular wariness of a man who has gotten into a boat and only then noticed how far from shore he is. If this goes wrong, Lord Voss, she looked up at him. This kingdom has been governed by a man for 9 years who has allowed his private failures to dictate his public policy. He has been compromised since the 4th month of this affair. He does not want the truth to surface. He will not look too closely at evidence that offers him an escape from it. She paused. This will not go wrong because the king does not want it to. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he took the document back when she held it out, tucked it inside his coat, and left. Celine turned back to her table. She sat for a moment in the silence of the room. Outside the window, the palace courtyard was beginning to lighten, first gray, then the early yellow of a cold morning. She thought about Elara Ashwin Thorncrest sitting upright in the birth chamber with a son on each arm. She thought about the expression women wore when they had just produced something undeniable. She thought, not for long. Then she picked up her quill and began to write. Job. The naming ceremony was held 7 days after the birth in the Great Hall with the full court assembled. Elara stood at the front of the dais in the formal robes of the Luna, deep blue, trimmed in the silver that marked the Thorncrest line. And she held herself the way she had trained herself to hold herself in large rooms, spine vertical, chin steady, eyes moving at a pace that suggested she was recording rather than reacting. Her body still ached. Sleep had been a negotiation. The twins were held by their nurses at the side of the dais, their faces pink and outraged at the noise of the assembled crowd. Darius stood beside her. He had been beside her all week, and yet she had felt the particular aloneness of a woman standing in a room full of her husband's other priorities. He was not cruel to her. He had never been cruel to her. What he had been, increasingly over the past months, was absent, present in body and elsewhere in everything that mattered. She had watched this happen and tried to pull him back and eventually understood that you cannot pull a man back who has decided that looking at you is a form of admission. She smiled for the court. She was very good at smiling for the court. The boys were brought forward. Ronan, the elder by 15 minutes, named in the formal record as first prince and heir to the Thorncrest crown. Kael, named second prince. Their names were spoken by the court herald and then by Darius in his formal alpha voice, the voice that dropped into a register that moved through stone, that she had found intimidating once and now registered simply as a quality of the room. The nobles cheered. Elara looked at her sons during the cheering. Ronan looked mildly offended by all the noise. Kael had gone very still, the way he went still when he was paying attention, his gray eyes tracking movement with a focus that seemed improbable for a week-old infant and would prove, she would discover, to be entirely characteristic. She thought, whatever else is true, whatever comes. These two. She squared her shoulders and turned to face the court and accepted the bows and the formal acknowledgments and the words of congratulation from lords who were simultaneously calculating what her son's existence meant for their own futures. She thanked them. She spoke briefly, clearly, without notes. She had never needed notes. Lord Bastian caught her eye from the third row and gave her a small private nod that meant, "You are handling this with more grace than it deserves." She gave him nothing back but a fractional tilt of her head that meant, "I know, but..." It came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the birth. The palace was in its morning rhythm, guards rotating, kitchen fires started, the particular sound of a large household waking. Elara was in the nursery with Ronan when Lord Voss appeared at the door with 2 palace guards and a sealed document. She looked at the document first, then at Voss. He did not meet her eyes, which told her most of what she needed to know. "Luna Elara Ashwin Thorncrest," Voss said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man reciting something he had memorized. "By order of the King's Council, you are required to present yourself to the throne room immediately to answer questions regarding your correspondence." She looked at Ronan in her arms. He was asleep. "My correspondence," she said. "Letters alleged to have been sent to Alpha Korn Valdris of the Northern Territories. Bearing your seal." A pause. "The content of these letters constitutes potential treason." The words sat in the nursery air like something that had been thrown hard and hadn't broken yet. Elara looked at Voss for a long moment. He was still not meeting her eyes. His hands were slightly too still, the stillness of a man holding a position, not the stillness of a man at ease. She understood then, with a clarity that was cold and clean and entirely without the trembling she might have expected, that this was not an investigation, this was a sentence, and the trial was going to be the formality that preceded announcing it. She handed Ronan to his nurse. She smoothed the front of her robe. She turned to Lord Voss and said, "Lead the way," in a voice that did not shake, because she had decided in the 3 seconds between understanding and responding that whatever Celine Morvan had built to destroy her, it was not going to have the additional gift of watching her collapse. She walked between the guards through her own palace, past the tapestries she had chosen and the floors she had walked for 9 years, and the sound of her steps on the stone was steady and even all the way to the throne room door. The throne room was full. That was the first thing that landed. They had assembled the full court. Every noble house, every minister, the senior military commanders in their formal dress. The room that had been designed to diminish men had been set for spectacle, and she was the spectacle. Darius sat on the throne. He was not looking at her when she entered. He was looking at the middle distance above the assembled lords, his jaw set, his hands on the arms of the throne with the particular grip of a man holding something he is not sure he deserves. She walked the length of the room to the designated position before the dais. The position for the accused she registered. She knew this room well enough to know that, and she stopped and looked up at him. He met her eyes. There it was. She saw it the moment their eyes connected. The specific guilt of a man who knows he is doing wrong and has decided to do it anyway, who has built a justification elaborate enough to live inside. Not cruelty. Something worse. Cowardice dressed in duty. He had told himself a story about this that let him sit on that throne and put her in this position and not burn the building down himself. She thought, "I see you." She thought, "You always knew I could." She thought, "That is why you are doing it now, while I'm still recovering from carrying your sons." Lord Voss stepped forward from the council line and began to read. The charges were detailed. The letters, allegedly dispatched through a member of her personal staff, were produced and read aloud. Flowery correspondence about border territory, about the weakness of the Thorncrest bloodline, about an arrangement with Alpha Valdris to destabilize the kingdom from the north. Her seal was on them. The language was almost right, almost her cadence, almost the register she used in formal correspondence, but not quite. The way a painting is not quite a person, even when it captures their face perfectly. She listened to the whole reading without expression. When it was done, Lord Voss said, "The council has found sufficient grounds. Luna Ashwin Thorncrest is removed from her title and position pending resolution of these allegations, pending the king's final judgment. Elara waited a beat. Then she said, in a voice that reached the back of the room without effort, "I would like to speak to my husband." A ripple through the court, murmuring. The silence that followed the murmuring was of a different quality, dense, anticipatory. Darius looked at her. "There is nothing to speak," he said. His voice was flat, and she hated him a little for how steady it was. "The evidence has been presented." "The evidence," she said, "is forged. You know it is forged. There is not a man in this room who does not understand that those letters are forged." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I am asking you, before this court, to look at what you are doing." Silence. Darius said nothing. She looked at him with the full weight of 9 years and 2 sons, and every private conversation in the dark, and everything she had understood in the East Corridor, and everything she had not said because she had believed, she had kept on believing, that there was still something in him worth reaching. "Darius," she said quietly, "just his name." He looked away. That was the answer. That was all the answer there was. He looked away from her in front of the full court, and the silence in the room changed shape, became something different. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of a threshold being crossed, of something that cannot be uncrossed. He said to the room, "Remove her title. Prepare the exile order." A pause that lasted almost too long. She leaves the palace before nightfall. The sound that came through the court was not protest. These were not men who protested kings, but it was something. An exhale, a shift, the sound of 4 people registering that a line had been drawn in a place none of them could now pretend they hadn't seen. Elara turned from the dais and walked toward the door. She walked slowly. She walked the way she had walked in. She did not let them see her hands, which had finally, belatedly, started to shake. She made it to the corridor before Lord Bastian appeared at her side, and he said nothing because he was a man who understood when speech was useless, and he walked with her as far as the corridor branched, and then stopped because there was nothing further he could do without crossing a line that would cost him his position and therefore his ability to be useful to anyone at all. She walked the rest of the way alone. In the nursery, Ronan was still asleep. Kael was awake, gray-eyed, watching the window. She stood in the doorway for 30 seconds and simply looked at them. At the clean, specific reality of them, at the fact of their existence, at the way Kael's eyes tracked to her the moment she appeared as if he had been waiting for exactly her. She thought, the man on that throne just made the largest mistake of his reign. She thought, he knows it. That is why he could not look at me. She thought, I am going to need every hour of the next 17 years. She crossed to Kael and picked him up and felt his weight settle against her chest, and she stood in the nursery of the palace she was being expelled from before nightfall, carrying the heir they had just stripped of lineage, and she made him a promise in a voice too low to carry past the room. She said, "You are going to grow up knowing exactly what your father did, and you are going to learn what to do with that knowledge. Not revenge. Worse than that." Kael watched her with his gray eyes, serious as a general. She said, "Truth." Outside the nursery window in the courtyard below, she could see 2 palace guards crossing to the eastern gate, moving with the particular purpose of men who had been given a task and were setting about it. Setting about her removal. Setting about the erasure of 9 years in the span of an afternoon. And behind them, moving through the courtyard with a measured pace that looked casual and was anything but, was Lady Celine Morvain. Celine paused in the courtyard. She looked up at the nursery window. She could not have known Elara was standing there. The angle was wrong. The light was wrong. And yet she stopped in that exact spot and stood for a moment with her gray eyes on the window, her expression arranged into something that passed for thoughtfulness. Then she turned and continued across the courtyard, toward the entrance to the private corridor that led to the king's study. Elara watched her go. She thought, he is in there right now, telling himself he did what had to be done. She thought, she is in there now making sure he believes it. She pressed her lips to the top of Kael's head and held him one more moment and then placed him back with the nurses and stepped back into the corridor and began to move. Quickly now, because the afternoon was burning down and she had almost nothing, and almost nothing was not quite the same as nothing, And the difference between those two things was going to have to be enough. It was going to have to be enough. Because somewhere in the palace a door had just opened, and Celine Morvan had walked through it, and Darius Thorncrest had looked away from his wife in front of the full court. And nobody in that throne room had stopped him. Nobody. And that was when Elara understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just watched an empire decide what it values, that the only protection she had left in this world was herself. She moved through the corridor toward the archive room where she kept her private records, where the original contracts of her marriage were housed, where the documentation of her bloodline was sealed in wax and stored in the back of a locked chest that only she had the key to, and she told herself, take the records. Take the boys. Take nothing that they can use against you later. She reached the archive door. She put her hand on the latch. Behind her, at the corridor's end, she heard the sound of boots. Palace guards, 2 sets, moving toward her at a pace that was just faster than standard. They had sent them already. He had sent them already. Not to help her pack, not to give her until nightfall, as he had said in the throne room in front of every lord in the kingdom. Now. She looked back over her shoulder and saw them coming, and she looked at the archive door and she calculated the 12 seconds she had between her hand on the latch and their hands on her arms, and she made her decision. She shoved the door open. And she was 3 steps inside, reaching for the chest, when the guards arrived at the door, and the first one said, Luna, still using the title out of what was either habit or mercy, and she got the chest open, got her hands on the sealed documents, got them against her chest. And then the second guard was inside, and his hands were on her arms, and the documents were still in her grip but barely, and he was pulling her back toward the door with the particular efficiency of a man who has been told not to harm her and is interpreting that instruction as narrowly as possible. And in the struggle, the chest tipped and the rest of its contents spilled across the archive floor. Letters, contracts, record sheets, 12 years of private documents spreading across cold stone. And the guard pulled her back through the door, and she had 4 documents against her chest, and the rest of them were behind her on the archive floor, getting further away with every step. And the door closed. And Elara stood in the corridor with her arms held and 4 documents pressed to her chest. She did not know which 4. She had grabbed blind. She would not know until she was somewhere else entirely what she had managed to save. And she thought, everything that just happened in that room will be used against me until I can prove it shouldn't be. And she thought, that chest is in there. And she thought, 17 years. Maybe more. And then she stopped thinking about the archive and started thinking about the Northern Gate, and which of her household staff she could trust to carry a message before sunrise, and whether the mountain passes would be open this early in the season, and whether 2 newborn boys could survive a winter crossing, and whether their mother could. She was going to find out. The guards moved her toward the palace exit, and the autumn air came through the corridor grates, and she held 4 documents against her chest like a heartbeat, and the empire she had lived in for 9 years got smaller behind her with every step. The Northern Gate stood open when they brought her through it. That detail lodged in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. The gate standing open, as if her departure was simply another piece of palace logistics to be processed, filed, and forgotten before the next morning. She had expected it to be closed and opened specifically for her exile, had expected the sound of iron bolts drawn back as punctuation on the sentence Darius had passed in the throne room. But the gate was already open because the palace did not stop its daily operations for the expulsion of Aluna. Supply carts came in and out. Stable hands moved horses. The world did not pause. She had been in it for 9 years, and it had already forgotten she existed. Elara walked through the gate with her arms free. The guards had released her once the archive door was closed, reverting back to the formality of escort rather than restraint. And the cold autumn air hit the back of her throat, and she breathed it in deliberately, filling her lungs all the way to the bottom. Behind her, the palace rose in its familiar mass of black granite and torchlight. She did not look back. She had 4 documents against her chest, held under the outer layer of her robe. She had Mira walking 3 steps to her left, the girl's face white and set, carrying a bundled cloth pack that held 2 changes of clothing, a knife, and the small wooden box in which Elara kept the twins' first-hour foot wraps. Mira had appeared at the archive corridor without being summoned, had simply been there when the guards released her, had shoved the pack into her own arms and fallen into step without a word exchanged. 17 years old and more practical than half the lords who'd watched from the throne room. She had Ronan in the arms of his nurse, Davin. a woman of 40 who had agreed in a flat and matter-of-fact voice when Elara had 20 seconds to make the offer in the corridor between the archive and the east exit, that she had no particular loyalty to a palace that had not paid her wages in 3 months and would come if the Luna was going. She had Kael strapped against Davin's chest, wrapped in the thick wool carrier the woman had refused to be separated from since the birth. He was awake. He was always awake when things were happening. She had almost nothing else. She walked north because north was the only direction that made sense. South was the river territories. Thorncrest held all the way to the delta. East was the flatlands where she had no contacts and no shelter. West was the court city of Varath, where every noble house would know her face inside a day. North was the mountains. North was distance. North was the ancient Alpha clans who had existed in the high passes for 300 years without swearing loyalty to any king, who traded in their own coin and kept their own laws, and who had sent Elara's father a wedding gift 17 years ago, along with a letter noting, in the specific language of people who chose words with care, that they hoped the Ashwin bloodline would remain true to its origins, regardless of which crown it stood beside. She had read that letter once and filed it away as diplomacy. She was reading it now as something else. They were 4 hours out from the palace, moving by a trade road that had not been maintained well and was starting to show it, when she unfolded the 4 documents and read them by the last of the evening light. Mira walked beside her and held the pace and said nothing. The first document was the outer sheet of the original water contract, the one Voss had lifted her seal from. She recognized it immediately. It was useless to her, but it confirmed the mechanism. They had used legitimate paperwork as the physical base for the forgery. That meant someone with archive access. The second was a record of her personal expenses for the palace's 6th year. Also useless, but it documented 9 years of Ashwin Thorncrest household management in the Luna's name. Evidence of her institutional role. The third was the only one that mattered, a certified copy sealed by 2 independent witnesses of the original Ashwin bloodline document tracing her lineage directly to the pre-Thorncrest Alpha line of the Northern Territories. The document that confirmed her son's blood claim predated the throne they had just been stripped from. She folded it back with both hands and pressed it flat, and put it back inside her robe against her skin, where it would stay warm and dry. The 4th document was a letter, not hers. She did not recognize the hand initially, and then she did. Lord Bastion's. Written 6 weeks ago, addressed to no one, and therefore clearly written as a record for himself rather than as correspondence. A habit of old commanders. She read it twice and then held it for a moment in the failing light. He had documented, in his careful soldier's hand, the specific dates on which he had observed Lady Celine Morvain entering the East Corridor. 7 dates. 7 dates that corresponded, she realized as she cross-referenced them in her memory, to 7 occasions on which Darius had excused himself from formal events. Bastion had known. He had known, and he had written it down, and he had put the document in the archive where only she would know to find it, not where she would find it by accident, but where she would find it if she ever had reason to reach for proof. He had planned for this, not to stop it, to give her a weapon for after. She folded the letter and put it with the bloodline document against her skin. She thought, "You careful, loyal, impossible man." She thought, "I hope it does not cost you everything." She walked. They stopped before midnight at a drover's shelter 3 miles off the trade road, a low stone building that smelled of old straw and animal warmth, and which was empty of everything except a rusted hook on the wall and the remains of a fire that had been cold for at least 2 days. Davin nursed the boys in the corner while Mira built a new fire with the competence of someone who had grown up somewhere where fires were necessary rather than decorative, and Elara sat against the wall with her knees up and her eyes open and did not sleep. She thought about the weight of what she had. A bloodline document. A letter from Bastion. 2 newborn sons who did not yet understand that their existence had been declared politically inconvenient. 1 17-year-old girl, 1 practical nurse of 40, the clothes on her body, and a knife in a pack. What she did not have. Money. A horse. Any guarantee that the northern passes would be open this late in the season. Any guarantee that the Alpha clans would receive her. Any guarantee of anything at all beyond the cold and the distance and her own functional capacity to move through them. She had always understood power, abstractly, as a thing that was conferred. You were given a title, you were given a position, you stood inside the structure, and the structure validated you. She had operated that way for 9 years, competently, strategically, never under the illusion that her authority was separate from the institution that housed it. She was outside the structure now. There was no conferral coming. What she had was what she was, stripped back to its simplest form, a woman with a bloodline and a brain and 2 infants, and the knowledge of who had destroyed her, and the understanding that destroyed was not the same as finished unless she decided it was. She decided it wasn't. She closed her eyes for 3 hours and slept because she needed to. And when she woke, the fire was lower and Kael was watching the ceiling of the drover's shelter with his gray eyes. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she thought, "We are going to make it, because there is no acceptable alternative." She got up, and they moved. They reached the first northern settlement 8 days later. The settlement was called Orvsted, barely a settlement, technically, more a collection of stone houses arranged around a well with an inn that served as the only public building, and a blacksmith who worked 6 months a year and spent the other 6 hunting. Elara walked into the inn with Mira at her side and Davin and the boys waiting outside, and she sat down across from the innkeeper, a woman of 50 with the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything about 15 years ago, and she put her last piece of palace jewelry on the table, a silver ring with the Thorncrest emblem filed off. She had removed the emblem herself 3 days out, with a flat stone by a stream. "I need 3 nights," Elara said, "and directions to the pass road." The innkeeper looked at the ring. She looked at Elara. She looked at the way Alara's hands were holding the table, not gripping it, just resting there, but with the particular steadiness of a person who has decided that whatever they need to do, they will do it. "You're running," the innkeeper said. Not an accusation, just a statement. "I'm moving," Elara said. The innkeeper picked up the ring and turned it once in her fingers. 3 nights. There's a woman in the house 2 doors down who has goat's milk, if you've got infants that need more than what you're carrying. A pause. The pass road is 4 miles north of the well. There'll be snow on the high part by now, but it's crossable for another 3 weeks if you move. Elara said, "Thank you." The innkeeper said, "Don't thank me. I'm taking the ring." Set. Thornspire Palace, meanwhile, had moved on. This was the thing about institutions. They moved on. The court had its rhythms and its requirements and its 300 years of precedent telling it how to process the removal of a Luna. Quickly, cleanly, with as little public narrative as possible, and Darius was a king who understood the institutional logic of this, even as something beneath the institutional logic sat in him like a stone in still water, settling. He did not speak of Elara. He signed the documents that Voss put before him, and he held 2 audiences with the noble lords who required reassurance about the succession question. The twins' status, the official position was, remained secure as Thorncrest heirs regardless of their mother's actions. The bloodline ran through the father, and he administered the kingdom with the particular competence of a man who has learned to use work as a place to put everything he does not wish to examine. Celine came to the study on the 4th day after the exile. She did not come to comfort him. She had never been the kind of woman who offered comfort, and he had never been the kind of man who found it useful from her. What she offered instead was the thing that had undone him in the first place, complete clarity. She always knew exactly what was true and exactly what needed to be done about it, and she had never once, in the 2 years he had known her, blurred those 2 things together out of sentiment. "The lords are stabilizing," she said. She sat across from him at the study table, not in the Luna's chair. She had never once sat in the Luna's chair, and he had noticed that and found it, at different moments, either tactful or strategic, and had never been certain which. Kalos reports the Eastern houses are satisfied with the succession statement. Good. Bastion has been quiet. Darius looked up from the document in front of him. Bastion is always quiet. Bastion is specifically quiet about the exile. The difference between a man who has accepted something and a man who is waiting for the right moment is visible if you know what to look for. She met his eyes. He has been requesting archive access. Silence. Darius set down his pen. On what grounds? Administrative review of household expenses. It's a legitimate reason, and he's done it before. But the timing is a pause, not for effect, but because she was choosing precisely, worth knowing about. He leaned back in his chair. Bastian has served this crown for 30 years. I know. He is not a threat. Celine looked at him with her gray eyes and said nothing. She had learned precisely which moments required speech and which required the alternative. He said, I'll speak with him. She said, that might be enough. And by the tone of it, the lightness of it, she made clear that she was not convinced it would be, and that she was choosing not to argue the point, because arguing the point was not her approach. She planted things and let them grow in the direction they were going to grow in anyway. She stood. The twins need a formal guardian assigned while their status is in transition. One of the noble houses will expect the offer. It establishes your position as managing the succession cleanly. I haven't named anyone. No, you should. She moved toward the door. Voss has a recommendation. House Cauldron. Their lord is manageable and they haven't overcommitted on any side yet. She stopped at the door without turning. They're healthy, Darius. The boys. Davin left, but the replacement nurse came from the Cauldron household. She's competent. He did not respond. She left. He sat in the study for a long time after the door closed, and the stone in the still water settled a little further, and he told himself that what he had done had been necessary, and the word necessary did the work he needed it to do for exactly as long as he let himself focus on the documents in front of him. Then he stopped focusing on the documents. Then he did not know what to call what he had done. He did not reach a different answer. He simply sat with the question being unanswered, which was a new experience for a man who had spent his entire reign being certain. Lord Bastian was removed from his position as Lord Commander 11 days after the exile. The stated reason was retirement. He was 60 years old, which was not young for a man who had spent 40 years in active military service, and the formal language was generous, and the ceremony was brief, and the pension was real. None of the noble lords who attended the ceremony would have been able to point to a specific thing that was wrong with it. Bastian accepted the retirement with the expression of a man who had been expecting it and had used the interval to finish what he was doing. He left the palace the following morning. He did not leave the city. Second, Celine's ascent through the court was not announced. It didn't need to be. It happened the way most structural changes happen. Through 100 small adjustments that individually seemed like logistics and collectively amounted to architecture. She moved to the wing adjacent to the king's private corridor. She was present at 3 council sessions that month as an advisor without formal title, and the lords who might have objected found that the king had already accepted her presence by the time they noticed, and objecting after the fact was a different kind of conversation. Minister Kalos began routing certain treasury communications through her review before they reached Darius's table. She did not behave like a queen. That was the particular precision of her approach. She behaved like the person who understood the king better than anyone else did, who was simply making herself useful, who had no formal position and therefore could be removed at any time, which made her untouchable, because removing something you have not officially placed is an admission that it should not have been there. She was extremely good at this. What she was less good at, because no one is perfect, was patience with the parts of the plan that required other people to execute. Kalos came to her on the 17th day after the exile with a problem. The Ashwin bloodline document, he said. He was standing in her receiving room with his hat in his hands, which was always a bad sign. It should have been in the archive chest. Celine looked at him. Should have been. It wasn't. When we reviewed the archive contents after... He paused, choosing, after the corridor incident, the chest had been partially emptied. We believe she took documents when the guards were on their way. Which documents? We don't have a full inventory. The chest contents weren't cataloged regularly, but the bloodline certification is not in the archive. A pause. It could be with her. The room was very quiet. Celine set down the cup she was holding with care. She set it down the way she did everything, with precise intention, no wasted movement, the gesture of someone who has decided that all energy should move in useful directions. Find her, she said. Kalos shifted his weight. She's in the northern territories by now, possibly beyond the pass. The clans, I did not ask you to assess the difficulty, Celine said. I asked you to find her. Hire trackers. Use the border garrison if you can do it without Darius's signature. Do not come back to me to report that something is hard. Come back to me when it's done. Kalos nodded and was gone. Celine stood in the quiet of her receiving room and looked at the wall. A bloodline document in the hands of Elara Ashwin, hidden somewhere beyond the northern pass, carried by a woman who was intelligent and furious and had nothing left to lose. That was a different problem than the one she had calculated for. She had assumed the archive would be cleanly processed after the exile. She had not accounted for Bastion. She thought about Bastion. She thought about the timing of his archive access requests. She thought, he gave her something. She thought, what did he give her? She did not know. She could not know without knowing what had been in the archive, and the archive had not been properly cataloged. And that gap, that single organizational failure in an otherwise tight operation, sat in her chest now like a heat she could not locate precisely enough to address. She turned back to her work. She had a kingdom to manage, and a king who was increasingly useful, and a succession to secure, and a bloodline document somewhere in the northern mountains that needed to cease to exist. She had 3 other problems, smaller, that she was handling through Kalos and would be resolved within the month. She had the makings of an arrangement with 2 of the eastern border lords that would formalize her influence over the revenue corridors without requiring any public declaration. She had more than enough to do. The document could be found. The woman could be handled. There was time. She told herself there was time. Ulset. In the northern pass, 23 days after the exile, Elara Thorncrest stood at the highest point of the crossing road and looked south. She could not see the palace from here. The distance was too great and the mountains folded the land so that everything south of the first ridge was hidden. She was looking at rock and sky and the early winter white that had begun to appear on the high stone 2 days ago, and she was breathing hard from the climb, and Kael was strapped against her chest because Davin had been carrying him since morning and needed the relief. He was awake. He was always awake. She looked south for 30 seconds. It was not sentiment. It was calibration. Fixing in her body the understanding of where she was and where she had come from, burning that geography into herself as a fact rather than a wound. Because there was a difference between those 2 things, and she needed to be clear about which one she was carrying. Then she turned north and kept moving. Behind her, the tracks of her small group moved south through new snow, faint already, the wind working on them, and in another hour they would be gone entirely. She thought, let them try to follow. She thought about Celine Morvain in the palace, reading reports. She thought about what Celine would do when she understood that the bloodline document was missing. She thought about trackers and garrison soldiers, and the specific patience of a woman who planned in long timelines. She thought, I have 2 boys who are going to grow up here, in the cold, learning things you cannot teach in a throne room. She thought, you have a palace and a king and an empire built on a lie. She thought, let's see which one lasts. Kael made a sound against her chest. Not distress, just presence, the specific noise he made when he was paying attention to something she couldn't see yet. She looked down at him and he was watching the sky, gray eyes tracking something in the low clouds above the pass. She looked up. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them, moving south, not toward her. They hadn't seen her yet, or if they had, she was simply a woman with a child crossing a mountain, unremarkable. They carried the border garrison colors, moving with purpose, moving with a specific kind of purpose that she recognized from having lived in a palace, not patrol. Search. 23 days. She had thought she had more time than 23 days. She pressed her hand flat against Kael's back and looked at Mira and Davin and the 2 guards. Former palace staff, both of them, who had materialized at Orvstead and had not explained themselves beyond saying they were coming north. And she said quietly, off the road, now. Move into the rock line and don't stop moving until I say. Nobody asked questions. They moved into the rocks. Elara watched the riders through the gap in the stone as they came down the ridge. 3 men, garrison horses, saddlebags heavy enough to suggest they were planning for a long search rather than a quick one. They passed 40 feet away without looking at the rock line. One of them was talking. She couldn't hear the words over the wind. They moved south and got smaller and disappeared. She waited until they were completely gone. Then she turned to look at the narrow track that led down the north face of the pass toward the deep territories, toward the places the garrison didn't follow, toward the Alpha clans who had sent her father a letter 17 years ago about bloodlines and origins. She said to Mira and to Davin, and to the former palace staff, and to Kael against her chest, "We move faster from here." She did not wait for acknowledgement. She moved. And somewhere behind her in Thornspire Palace, in a corridor that smelled of stone and torch oil, in the rooms that had been hers for 9 years and were hers no longer, a door was closing on everything she had been, an opening without ceremony onto everything she was going to have to become. There was no version of the road ahead that did not require her to be harder than she had ever allowed herself to be. She had spent 9 years being soft in all the right diplomatic ways, yielding in the specific places that maintained peace, choosing patience over confrontation in every moment where confrontation would have cost her more than it gained. She was done with that calculation. She was done with patience as self-protection. She was going to have to find a different way to use it. Patience as a weapon, as a sharpening tool, as the thing you use to build something slowly enough that when it finally arrives, it is so solid that nothing that comes at it will be enough. The garrison riders had been searching for 23 days from exile. She had 17 years. The math was not complicated. She kept moving north, and the snow came down, and the palace fell further behind with every step. And somewhere in the high dark above the pass, the clouds opened briefly on a strip of cold, clear sky, and then closed again, and the snow continued, and she walked into it. The clan elder's name was Vorin, and he had the eyes of a man who had watched empires come and go and had long ago decided that the mountains were more reliable than either. He was 70 years old and stood 6 feet flat and moved through the longhouse of the Greyvile clan settlement with the particular ease of someone whose body had made peace with the altitude decades ago. His hair was white and cut close. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 50 years doing physical work and would spend however many remained doing the same. He had met Elara at the north face base of the pass with 4 of his people, said nothing while she explained who she was and what she carried, looked at the twins once each with an assessment that was brief and thorough, and then said, "Come." That had been 3 years ago. She thought about that sometimes, about the economy of it. No deliberation performed for her benefit, no theater of consideration. He had looked at her bloodline document and at Kael's gray eyes, and at the way she had stood in the cold after 6 days in the mountains without flinching, and he had made a decision in approximately 10 seconds that had given her sons their lives. She had learned from that. She had added it to the architecture of herself that the exile had forced her to rebuild from foundation up. The understanding that real authority never announced itself, that it simply acted, and that the space between a decision and its execution should be as small as possible. The Greyville settlement sat in a valley bowl 2,000 feet above the pass road, invisible from below, accessible by 3 routes that all looked like dead ends until you knew where to step. 300 people lived here in stone longhouses arranged around a central fire hall. They kept cattle and grew cold-weather grain and traded with 2 other clan settlements through routes the border garrison had been trying to map for 40 years without success. They trained their young from the age of 8. They had their own laws and their own council, and they had not sworn fealty to any Thorncrest king since Darius's grandfather had tried to levy taxes on the mountain passes and found his tax collectors returning without their horses or their collected coin, but otherwise unharmed. A message delivered with the particular precision of people who knew exactly how far to go. They were exactly what Elara had needed. Ronan was 3 years old now and had figured out how to climb the outer wall of the longhouse. Kael was 3 years old and had figured out how to watch his brother do it and calculate, from the ground, whether the next handhold was structurally sound. These were already, Vorin had said once over the evening fire, 2 different kinds of dangerous. She had taken that as the compliment it was. The message arrived in the 5th year. A rider from the settlement's trading route, a young man named Brissin, who ran the Eastern Exchange twice yearly, and who had the discretion that came from having grown up somewhere that valued it, came into the fire hall in the late afternoon with a weathered pack and the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had something he'd been carrying carefully for a while. He found Elara at the long table where she spent her evenings reviewing the clan's land records. which Vorin had asked her to help reorganize 3 years ago, and which had expanded by gradual and unspoken agreement into something closer to administrative oversight of the settlement's external dealings. She had not sought this. She had simply been useful, consistently, in the areas where her experience was specific, and usefulness in a place like Greyville accumulated the way snow accumulated, quietly, until one morning you noticed how much had gathered. Bracine set the pack down and pulled from it a letter sealed with no house emblem. She looked at the seal, plain wax, pressed with a thumb rather than a stamp, and something in her chest registered a frequency she had not felt in years. She picked it up. She turned it over. The handwriting on the outer fold was not a hand she recognized, but the word written beneath the address. A single word, no context, was a word she and Bastian had used once in a conversation about archive organization that no one else had been present for. Inventory. She broke the seal. The letter inside was 3 pages in Bastian's hand, written in the compressed style of a man who had learned to say necessary things in minimum space. She read it once through without stopping. Then she set it on the table and looked at the fire for a moment. Then she read it again. Besamt. Bastian had spent 5 years not being idle. The letter documented it with the same methodical care he had brought to 30 years of military command. He had remained in the capital city, not in the palace, not in any official capacity, simply in the city, in a rented room above a bookmaker's shop in the trade district, living on his pension and his savings and his particular talent for being unremarkable in public. He had spent those 5 years talking to people, not dramatically, not with any declared purpose. He had simply been an old man with time and a habit of listening, and in a court city there was no shortage of people who wanted to talk to someone who listened. He had, in 5 years, assembled a picture. The letter detailed what that picture showed. Celine had consolidated. Not openly, never openly, but the consolidation was visible in the outcomes. 3 lords who had been reliably independent had shifted their positions on revenue policy in the same 18-month window. 2 of them had debts that Voss's Treasury Department had quietly restructured. The third had a son in a military posting that had recently been upgraded to a significantly better assignment. The connections were not provable in a court. They were the kind of connections that existed in the gap between what could be demonstrated and what anyone paying attention could see. The tax structure on the northern and eastern territories had been revised twice in 4 years. The revision language was technical, and the stated purpose was administrative efficiency. The practical effect was that revenue from those territories now routed through 2 additional ministry offices before it reached the General Treasury, offices that had been created under Voss's authority in the same period. Darius had signed every revision. Bastian's assessment of Darius occupied half a page and was written with the particular restraint of a man choosing to document rather than judge. The king administered. He made decisions. He was present in the physical sense of the word. But Bastian had spoken to enough people who attended council sessions and enough former palace staff now scattered through the city to assemble a clear account of how those decisions were being shaped. Not dictated. Selena was too precise for that. And Darius was too proud to accept dictation. She offered analysis. She framed options. She identified which information reached him and in what sequence. The decisions that emerged from that process were technically Darius's. The architecture of the choices was hers. It was, Bastian wrote, the most efficient form of control he had ever observed, because it left the man on the throne with complete conviction that he was governing freely. The last page was different in tone. Bastian's handwriting changed slightly. The compression released a little, as if he had stopped writing for the record and started writing for her specifically. He wrote, "The boys are being discussed in the capital. Not officially. In the way things are discussed when the official position is too clean to survive contact with what people actually think. There are lords who have been waiting for the succession question to surface properly. Celine knows this. I believe she is building toward a resolution to the twin question that does not require them to reach adulthood. I cannot prove this. I am telling you because I believe you already suspected it, and because you deserve to have your suspicion confirmed by someone who has been watching closely." He wrote, "You have 5 years at most before the question becomes acute, possibly less." He wrote, I am too old and too well watched to be useful inside the city any longer. But I have names. I have documentation. If you have built what I think you have been building, there may be a time when these things are useful to you. Send word through Brissan when you are ready to receive them." He signed it with a single letter. B. Elara set the letter down. She sat with both hands flat on the table and looked at the fire and breathed at a normal rate and was aware, in the specific way she had become aware of things over 5 years of necessary sharpening, that the thing she was feeling was not fear. Fear was a response to surprise, and she was not surprised. She was calculating. 5 years, possibly less. 2 boys who were currently climbing longhouse walls and learning to count in 2 languages, and who had no idea that somewhere south of the mountain pass, a woman in a palace corridor was trying to determine the tidiest way to ensure they never became a problem. She thought about what Vorin had built here over 70 years. She thought about the clan settlements in the valleys, 3 of them within a day's travel, 2 more within 3. She thought about the trading routes and the young men who ran them, and the particular quality of the people who lived at altitude, who had spent generations developing the specific character that came from choosing difficulty over convenience. She thought about Ronan, who at 5 years old had already figured out that the best way to get people to do what you wanted was to make them feel like it was their idea. She thought about Kael, who at 5 years old had already figured out that the best way to understand a problem was to find its weakest point and press there quietly until it told you something. She thought, they are going to be extraordinary. She thought, I need more time than I have. She picked up the letter and went to find Vorin. He was in the eastern field where the clan kept its training ground, a flat stretch of hard earth where the young trained every morning, regardless of weather. At this hour it was empty except for him, standing at the edge with his hands behind his back, watching something in the middle distance that she couldn't identify. She stood beside him without speaking. After a moment she said, I need to tell you something. You need to ask me something, he said. You've been telling me things for 5 years. This is different. She looked at the field. I need to start training them differently. He did not ask who she meant. How old are they now? 5. A silence. Not hesitation, consideration. There was a difference that she had learned to recognize. What does differently mean? I've been teaching them what I know, what I learned in a palace. That's not wrong, but it's not enough. She paused. They need to learn what you know, what the people here know, not as a supplement, as the foundation. Vorin was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the training field with the particular bite of high altitude in late autumn. You're expecting them to fight for something, he said. Yes. At what age? She thought about Bastion's letter. 5 years, possibly less. They need to be ready to begin building alliances by the time they're 12, leading by 16, ready to move by 18. He turned to look at her then. He studied her face the way he studied everything, without performance, without reaction, simply taking in information. That's a hard timeline. I know. They're 5 years old. I know. He looked back at the field. My grandson started at 8. He's the best fighter in the settlement now, and he resents every morning of his life. I'm not asking you to make them miserable. I'm asking you to make them ready. She paused. There's a difference. Another silence, longer this time. What's in the letter? He said. She handed it to him. He read it. He read it slowly, which was how he read everything, and when he was done, he refolded it with care and held it for a moment before giving it back. She'll send trackers again, he said. Yes. More competent ones this time. Yes. He nodded once with the particular finality of a man who has processed a problem and arrived at a response and is done with the processing stage. I'll start them at 6, 1 year to let them finish being small. He turned and began walking back toward the longhouses. Tell Ronan to stop climbing the wall. He's going to need those hands intact. She stood in the field after he left and looked south, which she did sometimes, not out of longing, but out of the same calibration she had done at the top of the pass 5 years ago. Fixing the geography. Keeping the distance real rather than abstract. Somewhere south of the mountains, a woman was planning her son's deaths with the same precision she had used to plan their mother's exile. Somewhere south of the mountains, a king was governing with the complete conviction that his choices were his own. Somewhere south of the mountains, a kingdom was beginning to rot in the specific way that kingdoms rotted when the person making decisions confused stability with stasis. When they confused the absence of visible chaos with the absence of damage, not understanding that the most dangerous deterioration was the kind that accumulated in the dark, in the structures underneath the visible surface, in the people who had stopped expecting anything better and had begun to build their survival around that expectation. Elara was going to use all of it. She was going to use every year of rot and every lord who had been bought and every piece of documentation Bastion had assembled and every capability her sons were going to develop in this valley. And she was going to build from those pieces a case so complete and a force so undeniable that when she finally came south again, there would be nothing Celine Morvain could do except stand in the path of it. She was not naive about what that required of her. She had spent 5 years becoming someone she had not been when she left. She had lost the specific softness that palace life preserved in people who had access to comfort, the softness of someone who had never been genuinely cold or genuinely hungry or genuinely alone with 2 infants in a drover's shelter, calculating the distance to the nearest settlement. She had not mourned that softness. It had not, it turned out, been the essential part of her. The essential part was underneath, and the cold had clarified it the way cold clarified most things, by stripping away everything that couldn't survive it. But the next part was going to require something beyond survival. She had been surviving. Now she was going to have to build. And building required her to be something she had resisted becoming because the version of herself she had brought into exile had deeply, operatively believed, that there was still a version of this that ended without total war. That version of herself had been wrong. The letter from Bastion had not told her anything she hadn't suspected. But suspecting and knowing were different in the specific way that mattered. You could continue hoping against a suspicion in the small hours when hope was the only thing keeping you moving. You could not hope against a fact written in someone else's careful hand. She looked south until she had fixed it fully and completely, and without remainder. Then she turned north and walked back toward the longhouses and the fire and her sons, who were 5 years old and had no idea what was coming, and who were going to need every hour she could give them between now and the day they would have to decide what to do with the inheritance she was preparing. Not a throne, not a title, not the restored honor of a woman who had been wrongfully exiled. She was preparing them to hold truth up in front of a kingdom that had accepted a lie for so long that it had begun to mistake the lie for its own history, and to hold it there long enough that the kingdom had no choice but to look at it. That was going to require force, yes, force of arms, because some things did not yield to anything else. She understood that. She had never been naive about that. But force without truth was just more of what had already broken everything. She was going to bring both. She pushed open the longhouse door, and the warmth and the light and the sound of her sons arguing about something came at her all at once, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, letting it register, the specific, irreplaceable, completely ordinary reality of them. And then she went inside, in Thornspire Palace, on the same night that Elara read Bastion's letter in the fire hall of a mountain settlement 2 days' hard ride north of the border garrison. Celine Morvain stood in Darius's study and watched him sign a document he had not read carefully. She could tell when he hadn't read carefully. His signature was slightly different, more fluid, less the deliberate mark of a man applying his name to something specific, and more the automatic gesture of a man processing paperwork. She had learned the difference in the first year. The document was a treasury order authorizing the restructuring of the northern tax collection routes. It was the third such order in 4 years. The language was technical, and the stated purpose was administrative efficiency, and neither of those things was the point. She took the document when he set down the pen and said, "The council needs an answer on the eastern water rights." "What's the answer?" "That we're reviewing the existing agreement." She paused. "It keeps both parties waiting without committing us to either position." "Fine." She looked at him. He had the quality of a man who was present but not attending, technically functional, going through the forms. He had been like this for months now, increasingly. Not grief exactly, not guilt in any active sense, more like a man who had made a series of decisions that could not be unmade and had arranged his interior life around the fact of them, the way you arranged furniture around a wall that couldn't be moved, working with the architecture rather than against it, and eventually forgetting that the wall had not always been there. "There are reports from the northern garrison," she said. His eyes moved to her. "The settlements in the high valleys," she said. "The clan territories. There have been changes in the trading patterns over the past 2 years. Increased output, more organized distribution." She kept her voice level, informational. "The garrison commander thinks there may be some consolidation happening among the clans." "The clans have always consolidated when they felt pressure." "Yes." A pause. "I'm told a tracker team went into the high territory 8 months ago. They didn't come back." Darius was quiet for a moment. "Men get lost in the mountains." 3 experienced trackers, all gone at the same time. Another silence. She watched him, and he looked at the table, and she could see him doing the particular arithmetic of a man who wanted very much to arrive at a certain answer and was checking his work to make sure he could justify it. He said, "The clans have always been territorial about the high passes. This isn't new." She said, "No." She said nothing else. She let him sit with it. After a moment, he picked up the next document and began to read it, and the moment passed, and she moved toward the door with the treasury order in her hand. She stopped at the door. She said without turning, "The twin question will come up at the spring council. The Eastern lords have been patient, but patience has its own timeline." A pause. "You should have an answer prepared." He did not respond. She left. In the corridor, she walked to her own rooms and sat at her writing table and looked at the letter from the garrison commander that she had summarized for Darius and then set aside. The actual letter, which was more specific than the summary she had given him. The tracker team had not simply disappeared. One of them had been found, at the base of the pass road, alive, with a message tucked into his coat that was not addressed to anyone and contained only 4 words written in a hand the garrison commander did not recognize. She had recognized it. She had seen it once 9 years ago on a water contract. The 4 words were, "We are still here." Celine looked at the letter for a long time. Then she set it in the candle flame and watched it burn and thought about a woman in the mountains with a bloodline document and 2 sons and 12 years of preparation still ahead of her. And for the first time since the exile, in the privacy of a room she was absolutely certain was unobserved, she felt something she had not accounted for in any of her plans. Not fear, something more precise than fear. The specific cold of a person who has built a perfect structure and has just heard, from somewhere inside the walls, a sound that should not be there. She pressed the last corner of burning paper flat against the table until it was ash. Then she sat very still and began to recalculate. 12 years moved through the mountain valley the way glaciers moved. Slowly, with absolute certainty, reshaping everything they touched without announcing the change until you looked back and could not recognize the terrain you had started from. Ronan Thorncrest was 17 years old and stood 6'2" in bare feet with the particular build of someone who had spent 11 years training in altitude cold. Lean in the way that was not thin, dense in the way that was not bulky, the kind of physical presence that registered before the person speaking to him had consciously processed it. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and a quality that belonged to neither of them. The specific stillness of a young man who had learned early that the most dangerous thing in any room was often the thing that wasn't moving. Cale Thorncrest was 17 years old and stood an inch shorter than his brother and had their mother's dark amber coloring and gray eyes that had never stopped doing what they had done in the nursery, tracking, calculating, finding the structural weak point and pressing there quietly until something gave. He spoke less than Ronan. He had always spoken less than Ronan. What he said, when he said it, had the quality of a conclusion rather than an opinion. Between the two of them, in 12 years of training under Vorin and the 3 clan elders and their mother's particular curriculum of law, history, and the specific mechanics of institutional power, they had become something the mountain settlements had not produced in 3 generations. Genuine alpha leaders who understood both force and governance, who had learned to use each in its correct context, and who had, more importantly, learned the difference. Elara had given them everything she had. She had given them Bastion's documentation, received in pieces over 8 years through Bresson's trading routes, assembled into a case so complete and specific that it would hold in any legitimate court. She had given them the bloodline document and the water contract outer sheet and Bastion's personal letter and the original archive records that proved the forgery mechanism. She had given them her own 12 years of observation and analysis of how Selene had consolidated power and how the kingdom had deteriorated as a result. The tax restructuring, the ministry offices, the bought lords, the patterns visible only to someone who had been watching from outside the system and therefore could see the system whole. She had given them the contacts. 12 years of correspondence, careful and patient, through trading routes and clan intermediaries, and the particular network of people who had been displaced or diminished by the Thorncrest Court's reorganization under Selene's influence. Former palace staff, lords whose positions had been eroded, military officers who had been reassigned to peripheral postings for reasons that were officially administrative and practically political. People who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for something worth waiting for. And she had given them the clans, not through politics, not through negotiation or alliance building of the formal kind. She had given them the clans the way you gave someone a river, by pointing at it and stepping back. The clans had watched Ronan and Kael grow for 12 years. They had trained alongside them and hunted with them and sat in the fire hall through long winter evenings while the boys learned to think out loud. And what they had seen was not the children of a displaced Luna pressing a claim. What they had seen was 2 young men who treated the people of these settlements as people, as sources of knowledge and judgment and legitimate authority rather than as instruments. That was rarer than it had any right to be. By the time Ronan was 16, 3 clan settlements had pledged without being asked. By the time he was 17, the number was 9, and they had not pledged to the Thorncrest name or to the bloodline document or to the political case that Elara had assembled. They had pledged to the 2 young men who had grown up in the same cold and the same difficulty as their own children, who knew the difference between a good pass road and a dangerous one because they had traveled both, who had eaten the same food and trained in the same weather, and who had never, in 12 years, given anyone here a reason to doubt them. Elara had understood, watching this happen, that she had accidentally done the most important thing. She had not raised princes. She had raised men. The writer from the south arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, which was the same day of the week that Elara had walked out of Thornspire Palace 17 years ago, and she did not mark the coincidence as meaningful because she had spent 17 years training herself out of the habit of finding meaning in coincidence. What mattered was what the writer carried. He was one of Bastion's people, not Bastion himself, who was 77 now and could not make the mountain crossing. A younger man, 30s, with the compact build of someone who traveled professionally and the particular eyes of someone who had been trained to observe and report without editorializing. His name was Koro, and he sat at the fire hall table with both hands around a cup of hot grain drink, and he looked at Elara and at Ronan and at Kael, and he said, without preamble, "Selene is moving." The fire hall was otherwise empty. Elara had made it empty 20 minutes before Koro's arrival, on instinct, because instinct was something she had stopped second-guessing 8 years ago. "Moving how?" Ronan said. "She's been in contact with 4 mercenary alpha companies over the past 8 months. Not through official channels, through Voss, through cutouts. The contracts aren't on record anywhere that the standard ministry offices can find them. Bastion's contact inside the treasury found the payment trails." Koro set down his cup. "She's also been in contact with 2 of the noble houses that have been most dependent on the restructured revenue routes. The conversation, as Bastion understands it, is about what happens after." "After Darius," Kael said. "Yes." The fire hall was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the particular sound of early spring. Still cold, but with a different quality in it, a looseness that wasn't there in winter. Elara said, "Timeline." Bastion thinks she moves before midsummer. The mercenary contracts have what he believes are activation provisions tied to a specific window. He doesn't have the exact language, but the payment schedule implies commitment within 90 days. 90 days. She had planned for this. She had been planning for this for 12 years, with the particular discipline of a person who knows the plan may never be needed and also knows that if it is needed, there will be no time to build it then. She had the documentation. She had the alliances. She had the case and the contacts and the two young men sitting at this table. What she had not planned for was the specific compression of 90 days against the readiness she had assessed as requiring another year. She looked at Ronan. He was looking at the table in front of him, which was his thinking posture, not downward in defeat, but forward and slightly angled, as if he was reading something on the surface that wasn't there. He looked up and met her eyes, and she saw in his face the thing she had been building toward for 17 years, a person who understood exactly what was being asked and was doing the mathematics without flinching. He said, "If she moves first, the houses that are still undecided go to whoever controls the palace. If we move first—" "The legitimacy question is live," Kyle said. "We arrive before she acts, and we're invaders. We arrive after she acts, and we're liberators." He paused. "We need her to act first." Koro said, "Bastion anticipated that. He has a contact inside the palace staff. If there's a way to accelerate her timeline, to create conditions that make her move sooner than she's planned, he believes it can be done." Elara said, "What conditions?" Darius has been asking questions about the twin question. Specifically, he's been asking Celine directly, which he hasn't done before. Whatever she's been doing to manage his attention, something has slipped. He's starting to look at things he wasn't looking at. Koro paused. If that continues, if Darius gets enough of his attention back to become unpredictable, she may feel forced to move before she's fully ready. The room processed that. Kale said very quietly, "She'd try to kill him." "Yes." "Before she's activated the mercenary contracts fully." "Yes." Kyle looked at Ronan. Something passed between them in the look. Not words, not even quite communication in the standard sense. More the specific efficiency of two people who have processed the same information from the same foundation for 17 years and arrive at the same point almost simultaneously. Ronan looked at their mother. Elara said, "Tell Bastion to let it slip. Whatever is causing Darius to look more carefully, let it continue. Don't accelerate it artificially. Just don't stop it." Koro nodded once. "And your movement?" She looked at her sons. She looked at the fire. She looked at 17 years of preparation sitting in this room in the form of two young men who were, by every measure she had been able to apply, ready. She said, "We move in 40 days. We need to be in position before she acts, not after. The difference between being positioned and being seen is the mountain roads. Our people know them and her people don't." She paused. "Tell Bastion we are coming and to have his documentation ready to be presented to the full council the moment we arrive. Not before. The moment." Koro finished his drink and stood. He'll be glad to hear it. He left before nightfall. The 40 days that followed were the most densely organized 40 days of Elara's life, and she had organized some very dense days. The 9 clan settlements moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been thinking about this for years, and were finally allowed to act on what they had been thinking. Vorin, who was 82 years old and had announced that he intended to see this through regardless of what his knees thought about it, coordinated the timing with a precision that a palace general would have respected. Riders went to each settlement on the same night. Responses came back within 3 days. The assembly point was the southern base of the pass road, a location that put them 12 hours from the capital city's northern gate by hard ride. Ronan commanded the left flank and Kyle commanded the right, and Elara rode in the center because that was where the documentation was, and the documentation was the point of the entire operation. She had said this to them both clearly. We are not a conquering army. We are a correction. The moment we behave like a conquering army, we have become what we came to replace. They had listened. They understood. The force that moved south through the mountain pass on the 39th day was not large by the standards of continental warfare. 3,000 wolves across the 9 settlements, armed with the weapons that people who trained seriously in difficult terrain carried, which were not the parade weapons of a palace guard, but the practical tools of people who had spent 300 years defending ground that cost something to hold. They moved through the pass in darkness and reached the southern base before sunrise and made no fires. They waited. The message from Bastion's palace contact arrived 6 hours later. It was 4 words, the same economy as Elara's message to the garrison tracker 12 years ago, passed through 2 intermediaries, and arriving as a whispered report from a rider who had covered the 12 hours in 9. She moves tonight. Ronan got the message at the same moment Kael got it, delivered by 2 different runners simultaneously because that was how they had arranged the communication structure. Nothing critical through a single channel. They looked at each other across the 20 feet of open ground between their positions. Ronan said, "We move now." Kael said, "We move now." Elara, who had been standing between them and had heard both, said nothing. She was already moving toward her horse. The northern gate of Thornspire capital city was not Thornspire Palace. The palace sat at the city's center, 3 miles of streets and structures between the gate and the throne. 3 miles that in daylight would have taken an hour. In the dark, with 3,000 wolves moving through an urban landscape that most of them had never seen, it was a different calculation. Except that Bastian had spent 12 years thinking about this calculation. The contacts he had built in the city were not, primarily, fighters. They were people who knew where things were, which streets connected to which gates had fewer guards at which hours, which merchant corridors ran parallel to the main roads, and came out 3 blocks closer to the palace district than the obvious routes. He had mapped the city the way a man maps a place he intends to take back, with patience, with specificity, and with the understanding that knowledge of terrain was worth more than superior numbers in a place where numbers created noise. The force split at the northern gate. 2/3 went with Ronan on the primary approach, direct, visible, designed to occupy the palace guard's attention and establish the line of engagement clearly. 1/3 went with Kael through the merchant corridors, quieter, faster, aimed at the palace's eastern service entrance that Bastian had confirmed was managed by staff rather than guard rotations, and whose lock had not been changed in 4 years because nobody had considered it a security priority. Nobody had considered it a security priority because nobody had known that an 82-year-old clan elder had been sending someone to oil the hinges every 3 months for the past year. Elara went with Kael. The documentation went with Elara. Inside Thornspire Palace, Celine Morvan had made her decision at sundown. Darius had confronted her in the study 3 hours ago with a specific question about the Treasury restructuring orders. Not the general question, the specific one, with dates and amounts that he should not have been able to connect unless someone had helped him see the connection. She had managed the conversation. She had answered him with the particular calm of someone who had prepared for this contingency. And he had accepted the answer the way he had accepted so many answers over the years, because accepting her explanations was a habit he had built to protect himself from what the alternative required of him. But the question itself told her what she needed to know. He had help. Someone inside the system had given him the thread, and he had followed it far enough to ask the specific question, which meant that if she gave him another week, he would follow it further. She had given the signal to Voss before dinner. The mercenary companies were not yet fully positioned. She had planned for midsummer, not spring, and the difference was real. 2 of the 4 companies were in the capital. The other 2 were within 3 days' hard ride. She had the palace guard captains who had been brought into the arrangement over the past 2 years and who had their own reasons for preferring the outcome she was offering. It was enough. It would have to be enough. She sent for Darius at the second evening bell with a message framed as a security briefing, genuine enough in its surface concern that he would come without suspicion, because he always came when she framed things as security matters. He was, underneath everything, still a king who took his kingdom's safety seriously. That was one of the things she had used and had also, in her more honest moments, respected. She was waiting in the council chamber when the sounds started. They came from the northern approach first, the particular noise of a large force moving through city streets, which was different from crowd noise or ordinary night activity, which had a rhythm and a direction to it. She heard it through the council chamber's high windows, and she stood very still for 5 seconds while she processed what she was hearing and what it meant. Not a city disturbance, not a riot, an army. Her first clear thought was, she did not have another year. Her second thought was, the mercenary companies inside the palace needed to move now, before the approaching force had time to establish positions. She moved toward the door to give the order. She opened the door. Lord Bastien was standing in the corridor. He was 77 years old and had a cane in his left hand and a document case under his right arm, and the particular expression of a man who has spent 12 years waiting for a specific moment and has arrived at it without particular drama. He said, "Good evening, Lady Morvain." She looked at him. She looked at the document case. She looked at the two former palace staff members standing behind him, who were not, she registered, his usual companions. She said, "You should be in the city." "I am in the city," he said. "I've been in the city for 12 years. You knew that." "You should be in your rented room above the bookmaker's shop." "That would have been more convenient for you, yes." He held the document case against his side. "The council chamber is a good choice of location. The lords are assembled there. Voss sent for them 20 minutes ago for what he described as an emergency security briefing. They're all present." He paused. "I'd like to go in." She looked at the two men behind him. She looked at Bastian. She calculated the distance to the chamber door and the position of the palace guard captain she needed, and the time it would take to reach him and the time Bastian needed to walk through that door. She said, "This ends nothing." He said, "Go inside and find out." She stepped back. She let him through. Not because she had conceded, because she needed 15 minutes to reach the guard captain, and the chamber door was not the field of decision. The field of decision was the throne room, and the approach of whatever was coming through the northern streets, and the two mercenary companies inside the palace walls who were waiting for her signal. She turned and moved quickly through the corridor toward the east wing. Ronan hit the palace's main gate at the head of 400 wolves, and the gate guards made a decision that guards make when they are outnumbered and outpaced, and have not been given enough reason to die for the person who positioned them there. They held for 40 seconds, and then they opened the gate. He had expected to fight for the gate. He had planned for it. The absence of that fight cost him 3 seconds of processing. His mind running the scenario he had prepared and finding the scenario had changed, and in those 3 seconds he made the adjustment and signaled his people, and they moved through into the outer courtyard. The palace guard captain, who had been brought into Celine's arrangement, appeared on the inner wall with 60 guards, and the situation clarified. These were men who had committed. They had the particular stillness of people who understood that their futures ran through a specific outcome, and who had positioned themselves accordingly. 60 trained palace guards on the inner wall was not a symbolic gesture. Ronan stopped his advance 30 feet from the wall. He looked up at the captain, a man in his 40s named Harwick, whom he had been briefed on, whose name appeared in 3 of Bastian's documents in connection with the restructured guard rotations. He said, loud enough to carry, "This is over, Harwick. Whatever she promised you, she cannot deliver it from a prison cell." Harwick said nothing, but his eyes moved. To the force behind Ronan, to the walls, doing the arithmetic that everyone in this courtyard was doing. Ronan said, "I'm not offering you a choice between loyalty and surrender. I'm offering you the choice between a stupid death tonight and a live tomorrow where you answer for what you did and go home afterward. Those are the only 2 options you have." A pause. Harwick said, "And if I don't believe the second option is real?" Ronan said, "Then you die on that wall and I go inside anyway." Another pause. Longer. The courtyard was absolutely quiet except for the distant sound of noise from the eastern approaches where Kael's people were moving. Harwick lowered his sword. 30 seconds later, 60 palace guards were standing down. Ronan moved through the inner gate and told himself what his mother had told him on the road south. The sword is for when everything else fails. Try to make everything else not fail. He had made it not fail. Once. He moved toward the throne room at the center of the palace, where everything was going to end. Kael's group came through the eastern service entrance 4 minutes ahead of schedule because the hinges, as promised, were silent, and the lock, as promised, yielded in 3 seconds to the key that Bastian's contact had pressed from a wax mold and passed through Bressin's last trading route 2 weeks ago. Elara was through the entrance and into the palace's service corridor with the document case under her arm before the last of Kael's 40 people had cleared the door. She knew this corridor. She had walked it 500 times in 9 years. The palace smell hit her, stone and torch oil, and the particular cold that came from granite walls in a building that was never fully warm. and her body registered it before her mind did. A full-body recognition that was not nostalgia, but something more functional. The specific recalibration of a person who has returned to a place they know well enough to move through in the dark. She moved through the service corridor toward the council chamber. She was 43 years old and had not been inside this building in 17 years, and she felt no hesitation, which surprised her in a distant way. She had expected to feel something that needed to be managed. What she felt instead was the particular focus of a person who is doing the thing they have been building toward for a long time and has arrived at a place where the building is done and only the doing remains. She heard noise ahead, from the council chamber. Bastion's voice, and the voices of lords. The sound of a room confronting information it had not been expecting. She turned the corner into the main corridor. Celine Morvain was 20 feet ahead of her, moving fast toward the east wing, and she stopped. They looked at each other across 20 feet of corridor. Elara looked at Celine and registered everything that 17 years had done to both of them. Celine was 48 now, still precise, still the specific kind of controlled beauty that looked engineered, but with something different underneath it that showed in the eyes. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of a person who has spent 12 years being certain of their position and has just felt the floor move. Celine said, "You came back." Elara said, "I never left." A beat. Celine said, "You think a bloodline document ends this?" "I think the lords in that chamber are currently listening to 12 years of documentation that ends this," Elara said. "The document is the finish. The work was the 12 years." Celine looked at her for a long moment. She was calculating. Elara could see it, the same calculation she had watched from across a feast hall, in a throne room, in a corridor outside an archive door 17 years ago. Celine's calculations were always visible if you knew what to look for, because they were so precise that they had a specific texture, a focused quality that was different from ordinary thought. She said, "You brought an army through the northern gate. My sons brought an army." Semantics. "No," Elara said. "Not semantics. My sons built that army by being the kind of men people chose to follow. I did not build it for them. That is the difference between a claim and a mandate, and it is the difference between what you have and what they have." Something shifted in Celine's face. Not collapse. She was not a person who collapsed, but the specific adjustment of someone who has just heard the accurate assessment of a situation they had been assessing incorrectly. She said very quietly, "You have the bloodline document." "Yes." "Bastion's records." "Yes." "The original archive materials." "Yes." She looked at Elara for a long moment, and then she turned, not toward the east wing, but toward the corridor that led to the throne room, moving fast, with the particular purposeful speed of someone who has one card left and is going to play it. Elara moved after her. Tochet. The throne room doors were open. They were open because Darius had come here when the noise started, when the sounds of an army moving through his city had pulled him from whatever he had been doing and brought him to the room that was the center of his authority, the room where he had sat for 26 years and made the decisions that were supposed to hold his empire together. He was standing in the center of the throne room when Celine came through the door and Elara came through the door 30 seconds behind her. He looked at his wife, at his former wife, at the woman he had exiled 17 years ago, and his face did the complicated thing that faces do when they encounter a consequence they have spent 17 years not looking at directly. He looked older, not destroyed. He was still a large man with presence, still carried himself like someone who had spent decades in authority, but diminished in a specific way. The way a structure was diminished by years of small choices, not to repair what needed repairing until the accumulated damage was visible everywhere, and you could not point to a single moment it had happened. He said to Elara, "You came back." "Yes," she said. He said, "The lords are in the council chamber," she said, "with Bastion's documentation, all of it." He went very still. Celine turned from her position near the throne dais and looked at him, and the calculation in her face was gone, replaced by something more direct, more stripped of strategy, the look of a person who has arrived at the end of their options and is making one final assessment. She said, "Darius." He looked at her. She said, "The mercenary companies in the East Wing are ready. The guard captain—" "Harwick stood down," Elara said. 40 minutes ago. Celine's jaw tightened. She said to Darius with the particular urgency of someone playing the last card they have, "You signed every order. You authorized everything. If this documentation goes to the council, you go with it. Everything I did, you signed." Darius looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, with the full weight of 26 years of kingship and 10 years of this specific arrangement and 17 years of the specific weight that came from a decision made in a throne room that could not be unmade. And something shifted in his face that was not calculation and was not strategy. It was the specific look of a man who has finally, at the end of a very long road, stopped trying to make what he did into something he can live with and has accepted what it was. He said very quietly, "I know." Celine looked at him. He said, "I know what I signed. I knew when I signed it." A pause. "I knew when I stood in the throne room 17 years ago and looked at my wife and looked away." The room was completely silent. He turned to Elara. His eyes were the eyes of a man looking at something he had been not looking at for 17 years, and who has found that the thing, encountered directly, is both exactly what he expected and worse. He said, "I should have—" The east door exploded open. 2 of Celine's mercenary captains came through it with 12 men behind them, and the room changed shape entirely. Celine moved. She was across the room in 3 strides, and she had a blade from somewhere. Short, utilitarian, the kind of thing a person carried when they had spent years in a court where being seen with a weapon was inadvisable, and had found a solution to that problem. And she had it at Darius's throat before the mercenary captains had fully assessed the room. She said to the captains, "Secure the doors." They moved. Elara stood with the document case and 12 feet between her and the nearest mercenary and looked at Celine's blade at Darius's throat and did not move. Celine looked at her over Darius's shoulder. She said, "The documentation doesn't matter if the man who signed the orders is dead. There's no case without a living admission. There's no restoration without a king to restore from." Elara said, "You're wrong about both of those things." Celine pressed the blade slightly. A thin line appeared at Darius's throat. He did not move. He was very still, with the specific stillness of a man who has accepted that stillness is what the moment requires and is providing it without complaint. Elara said, "The documentation is in Bastion's hands, and the lords have already seen it. Darius dying in this room doesn't close the case, it becomes the case. You hold a king at knife point while his son's army is in the outer courtyard. There is no version of the next 10 minutes that ends with you walking out of this room in a position of power." The mercenary captains were at the doors, 12 men in the room. She looked at the room and did the mathematics that 12 years of preparation had built her to do. The east door, which the captains had come through and had not yet fully secured, was still 15 seconds from being locked. Kael was somewhere in the east service corridor. He was always where he was supposed to be. She kept her eyes on Celine, and she did not signal, and she did not speak, and she simply stood with the document case against her chest in the throne room of the palace she had been expelled from 17 years ago, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. The seconds moved. Celine's eyes tracked to the east door, a brief movement, the instinct to check the thing that was not yet secured, and in the half-second her attention moved, the east door opened. Kael came through it with 6 people and a sword already drawn, and the 12 mercenaries turned, and the room became a different room entirely. A room in which the mathematics had shifted so completely that everyone in it needed a moment to recalculate. Everyone except Celine. She moved. Not toward the door. Not toward an exit. Toward Elara. Directly. Fast. With the blade and the particular decision of a person who has processed the new mathematics and arrived at the only remaining option. If the documentation bearer goes down, the case goes with her. Darius grabbed her arm. He grabbed it with both hands, and he was a large man, and he had been the strongest alpha on the continent for 26 years, and whatever he had become in those years, that was still true in his body. He grabbed her arm, and she could not fully complete the movement, could not close the 12 feet between her and Elara, could only get half of it before his weight arrested her forward motion. She drove the blade backward. It went into his side, below the ribs, angled wrong for a killing blow, but deep enough. and the sound he made was the sound of someone who has been stabbed and has registered it and has decided not to make more noise than is necessary. He did not let go. He held her arm with both hands, and he looked across the room at Elara, and his face had in it something she had not seen there since the birth room 17 years ago. Something real, unperformed, the specific shock of a man encountering consequence. But different now, the consequence no longer approaching, but arrived, present, undeniable. Kyle crossed the room in 4 strides. Celine turned with the blade, and Elara moved. She had not moved like this in 17 years. Her body remembered it anyway. The specific movement that came from 11 years in a mountain valley, training alongside people who had spent 300 years developing the practical vocabulary of real violence, not court swordsmanship, not formal dueling, but the raw and economical language of people who needed to defend themselves in conditions that did not accommodate elegance. She dropped the document case. She crossed the remaining distance. She got her hands on Celine's blade arm at the wrist, both hands, and she twisted in the direction that the joint was not designed to accommodate. The blade went to the floor. Kyle was there. Celine went to her knees on the throne room floor, and Kyle had her arms behind her, and the mercenary captains at the door had assessed the room and made the same assessment Harwick had made in the outer courtyard, and were lowering their weapons. And Darius was on the floor with his hand pressed to his side and blood coming through his fingers, and Ronan was coming through the main doors with the first wave of his people behind him. And the throne room of Thornspire Palace was full of bodies and noise, and the particular disorder of a night that had broken in 17 different directions simultaneously. And Elara stood in the center of it with her hands empty and her chest heaving and her eyes on the document case lying 6 feet away on the throne room floor, its seal intact, its contents intact, 12 years of evidence intact. And she looked at her sons. Ronan was at the main doors. Kale was on his knees with his hands on Celine's arms. They both looked at her, across the noise and the chaos and the bleeding king on the floor, and she looked back at them. They were alive. The documentation was intact, and on the floor of the throne room, Darius Thorncrest pressed his hand against his side and looked up at the woman he had exiled 17 years ago and the sons he had tried to erase from the record of his kingdom. And his face was the face of a man who has run out of road. Ronan crossed the room and crouched beside him. He did not have the eyes of a son looking at a father. He had the eyes of a commander assessing a situation, clear, practical, without hatred and without sentiment, the specific quality of a young man who had been raised to understand that the most dangerous thing was emotion that displaced judgment. He said, "We need pressure on that wound." Darius looked at him. He said, with the specific effort of a man managing pain and losing, "You look like your mother." Ronan said, "I know." He pressed his own hand over Darius's and looked up and said to the room, "Someone bring me something to bind this." The room moved, and Celine Morvain, on her knees on the throne room floor with Kyle's hands on her arms and 12 years of power dismantling itself around her, looked at Elara and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. There was only the particular silence of an ending. Not clean, not resolved, still bleeding on the floor and still burning in the east wing where someone had knocked a torch during the entry and the fire was going to need attention, but an ending nonetheless. The architecture of lies that had held this palace together for 17 years was down, and what was left in its place was the raw and difficult truth of what had actually happened, which was worse in some ways and better in the only way that mattered. It was real. The throne room door was still open. Through it came the sound of the city, the particular sound of a place that is waking up to the fact that something has changed, not yet understanding what, but registering the change in the way cities registered things. In the streets, in the markets, in the conversations between people who had been told one story for 17 years and were about to be told another. Elara reached down and picked up the document case. She held it against her chest, the same way she had held it in the Eastern Service Corridor, the same way she had held 4 documents against her chest in a palace corridor 17 years ago, while a guard's hands pulled her toward the exit. She looked at the throne. She looked at her sons. She looked at Darius bleeding on the floor. And the night was not over. The East Wing fire needed handling, and the mercenary companies needed formal surrender, and the lords in the council chamber needed to be brought through what came next, and there were 100 things between this moment and anything that could be called resolution. But she had the documentation, and her sons were standing in the throne room of the empire that had tried to erase them. And the woman who had engineered everything was on the floor, and the throne room door was open. The East Wing fire took 3 hours to contain. It was not a large fire. Someone had knocked a wall torch during the entry, and the hanging caught, and the hanging spread to a storage room before anyone isolated it. But it was a real fire in a real building, and it required real people doing real work. And that was perhaps the most clarifying thing about the night, that empires, when they fell, did not fall into clean silence. They fell into logistics, into the immediate, unglamorous demand of things that needed handling right now, before the meaning of the night could be processed, before anyone had the space to understand what had just changed. Ronan handled the fire. He had not been asked to. He had simply looked at the smoke coming from the east corridor and had turned to the 8 people closest to him and said, "Move." And they had moved, and the fire was contained before midnight. This was the thing Elara had watched develop in him over 17 years and had never been able to manufacture deliberately. The instinct to see what needed doing and do it without waiting for the structure that authorized him to act. You could not teach that. You could only create conditions where it either emerged or it didn't. In Ronan, it had emerged early and had never stopped growing. Kale spent those 3 hours in the council chamber with Bastion and the assembled lords. Bastion presented the documentation with the economy of a man who had been preparing the presentation for 12 years and had no patience for theater. He laid the forgery evidence first, the mechanism, the materials, the specific chain from Voss to the unnamed forger, to the false correspondence that had carried Elara's seal. He laid the witness documentation second, the bought testimony, the names, the payments. He laid the treasury restructuring records third, with the annotated connections between the ministry offices and Celine's influence over their creation. He laid Darius's signatures last, in sequence, each one dated, each one corresponding to a decision that had shaped the kingdom's deterioration over 17 years. The Lord sat with it. Kale sat at the end of the table and watched them sit with it and said nothing for a long time. He had learned this from his mother, that there were moments when the most powerful thing you could do was let information exist in a room without rushing toward it. Let people arrive at their own understanding rather than being led to it, because understanding you arrived at yourself was the only kind that held under pressure. Lord Fenwick Kalos was in the chamber. He had been summoned along with the others and had come because not coming would have been its own statement, and he had spent 17 years avoiding statements. He sat at the far end of the table from Bastion, and he did not speak, and his face had the particular grayness of a man who has spent a long time as the structural support for something that has just collapsed and is now calculating the weight of what was above him. Kyle looked at him once, directly, and Kalos met his eyes for 2 seconds before looking away. Kale said to the room, "Every person in this chamber is going to have to make a decision before morning, not about loyalty. That question is settled. About accountability." He paused, letting the word exist in the room. The distinction matters because loyalty is a thing you can claim after the fact. Accountability is a thing you either accept or don't, and the record will show which you chose. He looked at Kalos. He said, "Lord Kalos, you processed the treasury orders." A silence. Kalos said, "I did." "You knew what they were." Another silence, longer. Kalos said, "Yes." The room registered that. The lords who had been uncommitted, the ones Celine had never fully purchased, who had simply gone along with the institutional reality as it presented itself, registered it with the specific attention of people learning in real time where the lines were being drawn and deciding which side of them they were on. Kael said, "You will provide full testimony, everything you know, every name, every date, every transaction. In exchange, you will be tried by the council rather than by military judgment." A pause. "That is the offer." Once. Kalos looked at the documentation spread across the table in front of Bastion. He looked at the assembled lords. He looked at the young man at the end of the table who had grown up in the northern mountains and had come south with an army, and who spoke with the particular precision of someone who had been thinking about this conversation for years. He said, "Agreed." Darius died before dawn. The wound had been managed, the bleeding stopped, the entry cleaned, the binding tight. But he was 61 years old and had taken a blade below the ribs, and his body had made its assessment of the situation and arrived at a conclusion that the surgeon confirmed in the third hour with the particular gentleness of someone delivering information they cannot change. Elara was with him. She had not planned to be. She had been in the corridor outside the room where the surgeon was working, dealing with the immediate requirements of the night. The mercenary company surrenders, the guard rotation, the messages that needed to go to the northern garrison before morning. And the surgeon had come to the door and said, quietly, that it would be soon, and she had looked at the door for a moment and then gone in. He was conscious, barely, but present, the specific quality of consciousness that was not fully in the room but had not left it yet. He looked at her when she came in, and his face did not change, which told her he had known she would come and had been waiting. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She looked at him. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of a long road that had gone wrong at a specific turn and had not recovered from it, whose body was showing the accumulated cost of 26 years of decisions made under the pressure of pride and fear, and the particular loneliness of a person who had spent decades being the apex of a structure and had therefore been unable to admit weakness to anyone inside it. He said, with the effort of someone managing breath carefully, "I told myself it was necessary." She said, "I know. I told myself for 17 years. I know that too." He looked at the ceiling. Did it help? The telling. She considered the question honestly, because he deserved honesty and because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from anything else. For a while, she said, in the first years, when I had nothing else to organize myself around. She paused. Then it stopped helping, and I had to find something else. What did you find? She looked at her hands in her lap. They were the hands of a woman who had spent 17 years doing physical work in difficult conditions, not the hands she had brought into this palace. The boys, she said, and the work, and eventually the understanding that what happened to me was not the most important thing about me. She paused. That took longer. He was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. Outside the window, the sky was beginning the specific gray that preceded dawn. Not light yet, but the absence of full dark. He said, "Ronan looks like you." "Everyone says he looks like you." "They're being diplomatic." A pause that cost him something. "He has the thing you have, the way of standing still and making the room rearrange itself around you." He exhaled. "Kyle has it differently, quieter." "Yes." "They're going to be—" He stopped, reassembled. "They're already what I tried to be." She looked at him directly. She said, "You were capable of it. That was always the truth of you. You had everything it required. You just—" She paused and chose and said the true thing. "You chose yourself over the truth when the truth was expensive, and you kept choosing it until the choosing was the only thing left." He did not look away from that. He absorbed it with the specific stillness of a man accepting weight rather than deflecting it. He said, "I'm sorry." The words sat in the room. She had thought about this moment. Not deliberately, not as a plan, but in the way the mind works through the night in the years of building something, rehearsing conversations that might or might not happen. She had thought about what she would say if he said sorry. She had thought about anger, which she had carried for years and had eventually had to put down because carrying it was taking weight she needed for other things. She had thought about what forgiveness meant to a person who had not asked for the wound and had been required to build their entire life around surviving it. She said, "I believe you." She said, "That's not the same as it being enough." He nodded, which cost him effort. She said, "But it's what I have for you." He closed his eyes. He breathed in a way that was measured and deliberate. The way a person breathed when breathing had become something that required management. She sat with him. She did not hold his hand. That would have been a different kind of dishonesty, the performance of a comfort that was not available, and she had spent 17 years refusing performances. She simply sat in the chair and was present in the room while the sky outside moved from gray to the first thin line of genuine light at the horizon. He died in that light. Quietly, without drama, the way most things ended when you removed the theater from them. Simply a cessation, a stillness that was different from the stillness of sleep. And the room was the same room it had been, and the light was the same light, and he was gone. She sat for another few minutes. Then she stood and smoothed the front of her robe and walked out of the room and down the corridor to where the night's work was still waiting. Celine Morvain's trial lasted 4 days. It was not a military tribunal. Kael had been specific about this, had argued for it in the first council session the morning after the night's events, with the particular clarity of someone who had thought through the implications of every available option. A military tribunal would have been faster and would have produced the same outcome, but would have attached a different meaning to the process, would have made it a victor's justice rather than an institutional one. And the difference between those two things was the difference between an ending and a foundation. The council tried her. The full council, with the documentation entered as evidence and Kalos's testimony, and the testimony of 4 other individuals who had been offered the same exchange and had accepted it. The lords who had been purchased were not tried. They were documented, publicly, in the council record, which was a different kind of consequence. Not imprisonment, but permanent institutional visibility, the specific accountability of having their choices written into the record that everyone who came after would read. Celine sat through the 4 days with the composure of a person who had decided that composure was the last thing she owned and she was not going to surrender it. She answered questions directly when the questions were direct. She did not perform contrition, she did not perform defiance. She was, until the last moment of the last day, exactly what she had always been, a person of extraordinary intelligence who had decided that the institution existed to be used rather than served, and who had been extremely good at that use until the thing she had not accounted for, the 17 years of preparation moving south through the mountain pass, had arrived. When the verdict was delivered, she looked at Kael across the chamber. He looked back at her. She said in the silence after the verdict, directed at him specifically, "You're better at this than I was." He said, "We had better teachers." She was taken to the holding cells. She would be exiled. The council had decided against execution, partly because Kael had argued for it, and Kael's arguments tended to arrive with structural logic that was difficult to dismantle. And his argument was that execution ended in accountability, but exile sustained it, that a person living with the consequences of their choices in a diminished world was a more honest punishment than a clean ending. Ronan had agreed. The council had agreed. She was sent north, not to the mountains, bitch, to the eastern coastal territories, where the climate was hard and the work was physical, and the people had no interest in court politics, and even less in the history of someone who had once held power in a palace 2 days' ride away. She went. Elara declined the throne on the 7th day after the night's events, in a full council session, with her sons present and Bastion present, and the full assembly of the noble lords who had spent a week recalibrating their understanding of the past 17 years. She declined it the way she did most things, directly, without theater, in language that said exactly what it meant. She said, "The throne of this empire has been held by a bloodline for 300 years, and the bloodline produced what it produced, strength in some generations, failure in others, and the specific failure of this generation, which was not a failure of strength, but a failure of character. I am not interested in restoring the bloodline to power. I am interested in restoring what the bloodline was supposed to serve." She paused. She said, "My sons were not raised to want this throne. They were raised to understand it. That is a more dangerous and more necessary thing, and it is the only qualification that matters now." She looked at Ronan. She looked at Kael. She said, "They should lead because they have earned the right to lead. Not because I carried them into exile and kept them alive and built everything I could build to bring them here. That would make this my victory rather than their mandate, and I will not give them my victory. I will give them the work." The council confirmed Ronan and Kael as co-rulers 3 days later, with a governance charter that Kael had spent 2 nights drafting and Ronan had spent 2 nights arguing with him about, and which had emerged from that process as something neither of them had written alone. A document that distributed authority across the council structure in a way that made another Celine nearly impossible, not by outlawing ambition, but by requiring transparency in every decision that touched public resources or succession, and by making the council's confirmation a necessary component of every significant governance act. Bastian read the charter twice and said it was the best thing he had seen come out of this palace in 40 years, which was the highest compliment he was constitutionally capable of giving. Elara left Thornspire Palace on the 43rd day after the night's events, not in exile, not driven out, not carrying 4 documents against her chest, not calculating the distance to the nearest settlement. She left because she had decided to leave, because the work she had come to do was done, and the work that remained belonged to her sons and not to her, and she understood, with the specific clarity of a person who has spent 17 years being clear about what things were, that staying would be a different kind of error than the one that had sent her north. She had spent 17 years in the mountain settlements. She had administrative roots there, actual functional ones, not the ceremonial roots of a court position. Voren was 82 and had been running the settlement records for 60 years, and had told her, in the particular plainness of a man who said what he meant, that the records had been better since she started working on them, and he would like her to come back and continue. That was where she went. Ronan walked her to the northern gate. He did not make a speech about it. He walked with her through the city in the early morning when the streets were still quiet, past the market stalls that were beginning to set up, past the ordinary life of a city that was reorganizing itself around the fact of new leadership, with the particular practicality of people who had learned to adapt. And when they reached the gate, he stopped and she stopped, and they looked at each other. He was 18 years old. He was going to be an extraordinary leader. She knew this not because she was his mother, but because she had spent 18 years watching him process difficulty, watching him make decisions, watching him learn from the ones that were wrong, and apply what he learned from them with a discipline that was not self-punishment, but genuine integration. He was going to make mistakes. He was going to face things she could not prepare him for because they did not exist yet, and he was going to have to find the resources for them in himself. She trusted those resources completely. She said, "The charter needs revision in the 3rd section. Kyle knows where." He said, "I know where." She said, "The Eastern Lords are going to test you in the 1st year, not dramatically, through small requests that seem administrative. Watch the pattern, not the individual requests." He said, "I will." She said, "Your brother is going to drive you absolutely insane on a regular basis." He said it. "He already does." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was the specific quality of early summer, clean, direct, without the harshness that would come later in the day. She said, "I am very proud of what you are. Not what you did, what you are." She paused. "There's a difference," he said with the particular brevity of a young man who had a mother who had explained the difference between things for 17 years and had absorbed it fully. "I know, but..." She pulled him into her arms and held him for a moment, a real moment, not a ceremonial one, and felt the size of him against her and remembered, against her will, the weight of him in the birth room when he had been 40 minutes old and had looked at everything in the room with the expression of someone arriving somewhere they had been intending to go. She let go. She walked through the gate, she walked north, and the city got smaller behind her, and the road that led toward the mountain pass opened ahead, and it was the same road she had traveled in the other direction 17 years ago. The same stone, the same grade, the same cold that came off the high ground even in summer. But she was not the same woman who had traveled it before. And the distance was not the same distance, and the thing she was carrying was not 4 documents pressed against her chest by fear. She was carrying herself. The self she had built in the cold, in the settlements, in the 12 years of preparation, and the 5 years of raising sons who did not know their own names yet, and the 17 years of deciding every morning that destroyed was not the same as finished. She had not been restored. Restoration implied returning to a prior state, and the prior state? Luna Elara Ashwin Thorncrest in a palace, in blue robes, smiling for the court, was not what she was and was not what she wanted. That woman had been real and had been good at what she was, and had loved something that turned out not to be worth the cost of loving it that way. She was something else now, something that did not have a court title and did not need one, something that had been built from the actual material of her life, from the cold and the work and the sons and the choices and the losses and the years of patience that had been, despite everything, worth their cost. She walked north. Behind her, in Thornspire Palace, Ronan and Cale Thorncrest were beginning the work of an empire that had been broken and would need to be rebuilt with different materials. Not pride, not bloodline, not the beautiful architecture of power for its own sake, but the harder and less elegant materials of accountability and transparency and the specific courage it took to govern in truth rather than in the performance of truth. They were going to make mistakes. They were going to face things she had not prepared them for. They were going to be extraordinary anyway. She knew this. She walked through the morning and the city fell behind her and the road rose toward the mountains and the air changed the way it always changed at altitude. Thinner, cleaner, demanding something specific from your lungs, not giving you what you needed without effort. She breathed. She kept walking. The mountains received her the way they always had, without ceremony, without judgment, simply as a feature of the landscape that had returned to its correct position. Above the pass, in the valley where she had spent 17 years, the fire hall would be lit. Vorin would be in the eastern field at this hour, watching the morning training with his hands behind his back and his 82-year-old knees that he refused to acknowledge. Mira, who was 34 now and ran the settlement's external trade operations with the same flat practicality she had shown at 17 when she had shoved a pack into Elara's arms and fallen into step without a word, would be at the records table. The settlement would be what it had been every morning for 300 years, a place where people who had chosen difficulty over convenience had built something that lasted, not because it was defended by force alone, but because it was worth defending. She crested the ridge and looked back one final time, south, the way she had always looked south, not out of longing, but out of calibration, fixing the geography, keeping the distance real. The palace was not visible from here. The mountains folded it away. She thought, two kings who grew up in the cold. She thought, let them build something worth the cost of everything it took to give them the chance. She thought, I have done what I came to do. She turned north. The valley opened below her, turned stone and green, and the particular color of high-altitude summer light, and she walked down into it, into the work that was hers and had always been hers, into the life she had built, when the life she was supposed to have was taken from her, and she had been left in the cold with almost nothing, and had looked at that almost nothing and decided it was enough to start with. It had been enough. She had made it enough. The fire hall door was open when she came through the settlement gate, and the smell of wood smoke and grain reached her while she was still 20 feet away, and somewhere inside she could hear Vorin's voice, low, specific, the voice of a man telling someone exactly what they were doing wrong and why. And she walked through the door and into the warmth. No one made a speech about it. No one had to. She sat down at the records table and pulled the nearest ledger toward her and found the page where the work had left off. She picked up a pen. She began.